3, 2, 1.
The College of Arts and Sciences presents Thinkers, Tinkers, and Talkers.
Something like, alright, watch your levels. Watch your levels.
This podcast is a chance to get to know the faculty behind the scenes, who they are, projects they are working on, or interesting tidbits about their field of study here at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, Louisiana.
Like, does this line sound right, or does it sound weird?
This podcast is for the faculty of NSU, students, and others who may be interested in the topics we discuss. I'm your host, Fallon Lincoln, joined by our producer, Grace Jensen.
That was a good one.
Thank you. Yeah, it kind of stings. In each episode, we will share with you tips and secrets from the faculty and staff here at NSU. We invite our listeners to get to know what's going on with the College of Arts and Sciences and get to know us beyond the classroom. So what are we doing?
Podcasting!
This is Thinkers, Tinkers, and Talkers. Hello everybody, welcome back to Thinkers, Tinkers, and Talkers. I'm your host, Fallon Lincoln, and I am joined today by Dr. Rebecca Macijeski.
Hello.
So, what I know about you, Dr. Macijeski, is that you are a professor here, and you are the faculty advisor for Argus, and you are also a poet, and you do lots of other things. So if you'd like to talk about yourself a little bit.
Sure. I joined the faculty at NSU here in 2017. Kind of telescoping back, I came from my PhD program at University of Nebraska, so a very different region, and then going even further back, I grew up in New England, so I've been really interested in the region hopping. One of my favorite roles here is I'm the coordinator of creative writing programs. I'm someone who is really interested and curious about creativity in lots of different forms. I was the kid who was always interested in drawing, always interested in playing music, always interested in writing. That was something that I was really grateful for in my house. I had tons of books. Both my parents were readers and musicians, so it's just a natural marriage that all the way through in my career has brought me here. So I get to be this champion of creativity. When I was an undergraduate, as a faculty person here, I like to try to remember my time as an undergraduate student. I was a double major in music and in English with a focus on writing. So I think those two paths, those two, fields of inquiry for my creativity have been really important to me as a poet. And I'm really conscious of bringing that to my teaching as well as to my writing, this sense that a lot of us maybe have one thing that becomes the field that we champion or the field that we dedicate ourselves to, but we're all curious about lots of different things. I think that's what creativity can really champion. So that's why I'm excited that literally gets to be my life. Poems get to be my life. It's a good thing.
That's awesome. Absolutely. It's really cool. So, what does it mean that you're a poet?
That's an interesting question. So I think poet is this weird word that has a lot of connotations. Some of them positive, some of them eccentric, some of them kind of in a what kind of animal are you sort of category. I just came from a scholar's thesis defense all about Emily Dickinson, so I'm thinking about poet stereotypes right now. I talked about, Emily Dickinson is this poet who's stereotyped. Popular culture knows her as this strange, isolated, eccentric person. I was thinking about how even sitcoms, even popular culture know to make fun of her as a poet. I don't know how many of you watched 30 Rock with Tina Fey, but she's playing Liz Lemon and she's going through some weird self-actualization time, and she has a cat named Emily Dickinson, and that's supposed to help us read her as isolated and strange. There's this Fox sitcom where this journalist is also going through a life upheaval time, and she gets some hens, and one of the hens is literally named Emily Chickinson. So I'm thinking about how poet is this weird word that comes with a lot of different associations. For me, being a poet means my curiosity is best expressed through language. I'm curious about lots of different things. I'm curious about the different forces that come together in my life to make me a unique person, which makes me curious about, that analog in other people. Whenever I'm spending time with students or other writers or just humans in my life, I'm always curious about what are the different competing forces that come together to make us who we are. And language is the site of that exploration for me. So thinking about different tensions, for example, I come from a small town in Vermont, and Vermont is known for, being very politically liberal, but my small town where I grew up was more conservative, so I'm interested in that sort of site of tension tension between conservative and liberal. You know, my background as a musician and as a poet, I'm really interested in how poems express their artistic intent or their meaning, not only in what the language, what the words actually say, but how they say. I was a violinist for many years. I played in orchestras, so I'm really interested in kind of the analogs that come from the poetry world and the music world. We both talk about phrasing. You know, how do you build, you know, that small unit of either language or melody? What does that mean? How do you pace? How do you breathe? And I really think about how my musical sensibility influences and impacts my poetic sensibility, because I think I write poems as opposed to other forms of written expression because I'm interested in the sound. I'm interested in how poetry can invoke or evoke an emotion in a way that feels more direct than perhaps even a really well-crafted story or essay. So I could go back and forth and make circuits, and that's part of what my poems are interested in doing, is not necessarily giving a linear, a direct, you know, straightforward answer. They're interested in exploration and discovery. Poetry for me is about being curious, essentially, and remembering that there are all kinds of forces that come together to make us who we are, some that we feel positive about, some that we feel negative about, some that we can decide or control, some that we can't control and will fight against or resist our entire lives. And poetry is a place through language where that resistance doesn't necessarily get to feel like struggle, it gets to feel like survival, and that's what's exciting. I also think being a poet means that curiosity influences how I move through my day, even when I'm not actively being a poet, meaning when I'm not actively drafting new poems or writing. I'm always curious for subtext. I'm always curious to discover what nuance might be going unexpressed or underexpressed, how we can read, you know, the body as language, read the environment as language being just a medium through which you express your experience. So I'm interested in poetry not only as, yes, I put pretty words in pretty order, I'm interested in poetry as a way to advocate for better attention, better presence, better curiosity, better empathy. So in that way, if I'm getting on a poetry soapbox, I do feel that poetry at its core can be a way for us to be better humans, more attentive humans, more creative, more engaged, more celebratory humans.
I like that. And I feel like I agree with a lot of your points about poetry. I'm not huge on like writing poetry. I've written a few poems in my days, but I'm not a big writer in general, probably because I spend most of my time writing essays.
Sure.
For English classes. More than I get to like write for fun, and I feel like I'd enjoy it a lot more if I was able to write for fun more. But I know a lot of students say, oh, I don't like poetry, or I'm it's like hard to read.
Yeah.
Or so how do you feel about the accessibility of poetry and why a lot of people feel shut out by poetry?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something I think about all the time. That's something I think about a lot when I'm writing, also when I'm crafting, you know, a syllabus that I want to share with students to help them feel engaged and excited and empowered rather than shut down before they even show up, which is a valid experience and feeling people have with poems. I think some of the problem comes with, at the high school level, at the middle school level, we have a culture of standardized testing that requires you have to demonstrate knowledge in a pretty formulaic way. I think this is not to down educators. They're in this boat. They have their own struggle with those expectations, you know, Fallon, since you're thinking about going into that world quite soon. I think there's a struggle with, you know, I use this phrase in my class, capital P poetry, this idea of poetry as an abstract that the academy or people who have gone through systems of artificial accreditation or validation decide this is the canon. Like, these are the poems. Like, you start to italicize, even when you say it out loud, the poems that count. You know, Longfellow, Tennyson, Byron, Keats, Shelley, some of these poets have really, really wonderful poems that I think are worthy of studying, but they were accessible for the day and time in which they were writing, which is very different from the time and day and place in which we as people are living and reading. So I think part of what I try to do in a very gentle way, in a way that feels like an invitation rather than saying, oh my gosh, why don't you love poems? Poems are amazing. Like, I'm not throwing pamphlets at people to like proselytize for the religion of poems. That feels artificial and weird. In a different way, if I'm in a teaching sense, I try to put poems on the syllabus that are accessible in the sense that they've been written recently. They've been written by individuals who are much closer in age to the students I'm working with than people who have been dead for over 100 years. I mean, I love people who've been dead for over 100 years too. Emily Dickinson will always be a true love. But I think the most important thing is to try to validate, yes, I understand you maybe feel locked out of poems, because some poems do lock you out. Some poems were written for you, and let's find the poems that were written for you. and even if it's in an abstract sense. So sometimes that also means in my 3000 level poetry class, I make it an explicit point that I, program on the syllabus mostly poets who are still alive, mostly poets who are of a demographic that's not a straight cis white man. And I do that intentionally. We don't talk about it in a sense that I'm, performing inclusivity. I don't think that feels genuine or sincere or important or good or smart. I just, by example, we read poets who are alive. We read poets who come from different traditions, poems who come from different ethnicities and backgrounds, poets of multiple genders and multiple other, markers that make them humans. So I really, really try to show people who maybe feel locked out, feel that poems aren't for them, that there are so many poems out there. People get sick of me saying, if you don't like poetry, it's kind of like saying you don't like music. It's literally just as broad.
And people say that, and it's strange.
Music? I mean, rap, jazz, R&B, contemporary classical, Mozart. Like, I can't list all the things. I can't list all the kinds of poetry. I think it's really about helping people find their own way.
And I think that music and poetry are so intertwined and interconnected because, it's just the sung word. Like, that's what music, or at least music with lyrics, is, because there's lots of music without lyrics. And even then, there's a creative and emotional intent with the music that people are making, even if there's no words that are being heard, But, like, last night, I was sitting with my roommates and we were listening to music, we were playing card games, and a Young Gravy song came on. And so he's this silly rapper. He makes very silly rap music. It's very unserious. But, like, his wordplay is so interesting and fun to, like, look at, and there's so many, like, layers to it. And I'm like Young Gravy is a modern poet.
Absolutely. Well, it's about rhythm, it's about sound, it's about connection. That reminds me of another response I wanted to give to your previous question about, what do I say to people who feel like they're locked out of poetry? I think going back to that vein of logic, thinking about standardized tests, I think too many people encounter poems in the setting that tells them there's only one way through this. Like, you have to figure out the puzzle of this poem. You have to do the escape room of this poem. And that's not what poems are for. There are a few poets who kind of revel in their own esotericism and like to be difficult and complicated and complex, and they explore complexity in those ways. For the most part, poems are not meant to be unlocked like a safe or a vault or an escape room. I like that analogy I just came up with. Poems are meant to be experienced. Poems are meant to be felt. Poems are meant to connect with the reader wherever they are at that moment, at that time. Sometimes you might read a poet and they're not for you because you're not at that place in your life. You're not at that, crossroad of discovery about yourself to be, spoken to by that poem. And that's okay. Maybe you try to read that poet in 5 years or 10 years and they'll blow your mind in the most exciting way. I think it also reminds me, there's a pressure, especially with young writers and people who are encountering poems in a student or a classroom setting where they have to figure out what's the poem about. Like, this is a poem about childhood, or this is a poem about trauma, or this is a poem that is about identity, broadly defined, whatever that means for the poet or for the reader. And it reminds me of, I don't remember the exact context when I encountered this quote, but I think about it all the time. I think I was watching maybe a PBS NewsHour, PBS TV series interview on with the poet Terrence Hayes, who's an American poet. And again, I don't remember the context, how we entered into this question in the interview, or even what the question was, but his response was, when somebody was asking him, how does he approach a poem? What is it about? That general topic area. He said, well, he writes poems that resist aboutness. So that was one of those phrases as a listener I had to kind of sit with for a minute before, and he paused. He let us kind of ponder it before he explained it a little bit more. My poems resist aboutness. I thought, okay, well, that sounds kind of big and maybe philosophical and abstract. But when he talked about it, he elaborated, and I think what he was getting at, I don't want to mind read for him, but what I took from that and what felt useful for me as a poet and a teacher of poetry is poems don't have to have a label. Poems don't have to be this thing. Poems can be something that's recreated every moment. Poems are recreated every moment in which they're read, and they're a new thing each time. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about writing poems for me. I'm very much aware that poetry, maybe this comes from my experience as a musician as well, both poetry and music are temporal arts. I'm very much aware of the fact that You cannot take in an entire poem or an entire piece of music in, one instance of time. You have to watch it unfold, listen to it unfold. Some poems you can get sort of a visual impression if you're encountering them on the page, but they're temporal, so that means they're ephemeral, which means they're kind of actually magic.
Which I feel like I've noticed a lot in a lot of poems that I've read. I'll go back and I'll revisit them, and I'm like, there's this whole other subtext, this whole other layer of meaning that I didn't get the first few times I read, or now that I'm in a different phase of my life, now I'm getting different meaning from it. And I experience a lot. I listen to a lot of music. I work at the radio station. I listen to music as a job also. But just in my day-to-day, the reason that I came to the station was because I love music so much. And literally last night I was texting my friend about like this new meaning I unveiled to the song that we know. And I'm like, I don't know how I never realized this. I've been listening to this song for years, and this new meaning has just been unmasked to me, and I'm like, wow.
And that's part of what's so exciting. You have an active, ongoing, long-term relationship with this piece of art, but it still unlocks stuff. I'm not going to remember the name of the artist or the song, but there's this song I've been listening to on Spotify. I don't know how many counts I'm up to. It's probably embarrassingly high. But I was listening to this track, and I was just listening to it in a new context. It was on the stereo in my car as I was driving, and I realized I had never noticed before that there's a consistent finger snap. Like the song literally the vocalist literally finger snaps through the whole song, and I've heard it dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and I only italicized heard it today.
The same thing happened with me with another song. It's a Childish Gambino song, where the beat to the song is the sound of a windshield wiper going like
right.
It's a very old album, very old, like that album came out in like 2014 maybe.
Sure.
It's pretty old. It's like 10 years old. I've been listening to it since like the 7th grade. It's been one of my favorite albums for years now, and I just like a few months ago I was just like, the beat is a windshield wiper. What do you mean? That's so cool.
Yeah. Well, that's something about work that's really effective. It can continue to surprise you. I think that's what the best art does, is it forces you, not forces in a overly restrictive way. Like, it invites you. Maybe that's a better verb. It invites you to pay attention in a new way, and when you're really engaging, stuff can unlock even in things that you know well.
But I also feel like the subjectivity of poetry may be one of the reasons that people are more resistant to it.
That makes sense.
People who aren't as, much of like creatives, or don't like introspection as much. Sure. Like I feel like with in some of my classes when we're reading poetry, like I remember in high school, our teacher was very open. She was like, whatever you interpret, like let me know what you're getting from this.
Right.
Like I don't want to tell you what to think about it, but a lot of kids are like, I kind of need you to tell me what to think. I'm not this introspective person. Like I'm not me, but these students,
sure.
They would have a hard time finding deeper meaning in a lot of poetry. So I feel like that's a big reason why a lot of like high school students, more specifically, or people that aren't super into poetry or English in general, reading, literature, yada yada, are a little more resistant to letting the meaning come to them, and that's something that I need to learn how to address, like in my future classroom, because I'm sure I'm going to have these kids reading poems.
Right.
I read Robert Frost as a freshman in high school, and we had to do that.
Yeah. As a poet from Vermont, I have a definite love-hate relationship with Robert Frost. People know Poet Vermont. They think of Robert Frost, the woods, all that stuff.
But one of the lessons that I'm working on for one of the classes I'm working with right now is, is this Shakespeare or rap lyrics, which is pretty cool, which I'm teaching tomorrow, which I'm really excited about, because I think a lot of these kids are going to be like, dang, that's crazy, because a lot of it's like Tupac, like he's a poet, like truly, and like some of these lines, they're so rich with meaning, and they're just beautiful. You'd think Shakespeare wrote them.
Right.
And then they're going to be surprised.
Uh-huh.
No, it's not Shakespeare.
And it's in a discovery, realization,
And
epiphany space.
It's going to make them realize that, like, oh, the way that, which I feel like would help a lot of people connect with poetry, because a lot of people connect with music, is the meaning that you find in songs and song lyrics. If you just treat a poem like that,
absolutely,
you'd find the meaning, and you just create a little tune. Most poems have like schemes, so like you can make a little beat in your head to sing along to it too. Like especially like sonnets, there is a
absolutely
structure.
There's
a
intensely
specific
defined
structure
rhythm
for that. So you know you can make a little song to it, and then you'll maybe singing it to yourself will help you find the meaning somehow.
Yeah. So I want to come back to a couple points you've said that are making me think about my own relationship to poems and teaching and helping people feel like they have a space in the poetry world, because that's a difficult hurdle we face often. So I hope I can come back to both of them. I have this thing where part of why I write poems is I feel like my mind pinballs a lot, and when I'm writing, it helps focus and contain. But when I'm in a scenario where I'm talking to some lovely folks and need to sound like a tenured professor, I get a little bit tongue-tied in my words. But I think it's good to share that because we're all humans and have moments. You were talking about maybe students don't know how they connect or don't feel comfortable sharing. I think sometimes it's important to honor that it can take a while for us to figure out what we like and what we don't like. And that's important. Figuring out what your aesthetic preferences are. Societally, we tend to feel like, well, I should know what I like and what I don't like. That's pretty easy. Maybe not. Maybe you haven't been exposed enough to know what's out there to know what you like and what you don't like. So in some of my earlier classes in creative writing, you know, I'm aware of this thing, like this looming shadow, like poetry is a trap we're all going to fall into, and I try to dispel that, but not in an aggressive way. Like, over time, we build this culture of, maybe another day we're going to talk about a poem in terms of what are the choices for line breaks and how is the metaphor built, more technical things. But today we're just going to say, maybe we're going to look at 3 different poems that treat a similar topic, but in different ways, and we're just going to talk about which one do you find yourself connecting to. I try to move away from what you like and what you don't like, only because I try to give, you know, folks tools to feel like they're confident talking about these things aesthetically. What do you connect to? Okay, well, if you feel connected, you feel some kind of emotion, you feel invited, you feel brought in.
Because even if you don't like it,
yeah.
I've read some poetry that I'm like, I don't like this.
Absolutely.
But you're still connecting with it in a way.
Yeah.
What don't you like about it?
Right, yes. If
like,
you're disconnected,
why don't you like it?
Theorize what would make you feel more connected. Or are you honest about you knowing your aesthetic a little bit more and just say, well, I don't like lists, or I don't like this kind of rhyme scheme, and you can recognize that it's a personal aesthetic, not necessarily a bias, but like, that's not my favorite, but I see what it's doing, I can respect it. And then you give people tools to feel like they have a foothold in that world, where it doesn't feel like, okay, here is this obscure poem from the 19th century, go. What? I have no strategy. So sometimes it takes a while to figure out realistically what you like and what you don't like and what you're drawn to. The other piece is, I feel like, you know, as students, and it's every generation of learners has, you know, similar but slightly differently inflected hurdles they face in their learning process. You know, when I was wondering if I should say what years I graduated from high school and college. Maybe we'll see if that comes later. But when I was going through school, I feel people feel this pressure now. You know, I have to do it the right way. The right way implies there is only right way. I have to perform. I have to complete all these tasks. I have to be perfect. I have to score high. And there's not a lot of room for developing, well, how do I care about this material? What is my contribution I want to make to this space? So it makes sense that, you know, when we arrive at college, we maybe don't even know what we like because we're performing competency. I know this skill, I did it, I graduated, hooray. And then suddenly you're in this new space where if you're studying with people who want to foster, you know, genuine understanding and curiosity, it can feel new and scary and strange and unmooring to have somebody just ask you point blank, what do you like about it? Like,
I don't know.
Has words? I don't know. And you have to experiment and read more and try out different things before you know what you like. That's a valid space. It takes a while. The other piece I was curious to talk about a little bit is you were talking about this cool lesson you're going to share about Shakespeare and Tupac, and they're both writers and both experimenting in language. I think often one of the struggles, one of the barriers to helping people understand that poetry can be for them is they're always told, or often told, I don't want to generalize or essentialize, they're often told, these poems count. Shakespeare counts, Emily Dickinson counts, Walt Whitman counts, Elizabeth Bishop counts, these kind of, grand people in like some master hall of poetry that exists in a highfalutin university somewhere. I think part of what I can do as an instructor and also as a writer is show people that, any kind of language you care about counts. Like, I want to try to dispel this idea that there are people out there who get to decide who's on the list. Like, you are a poet and these other people are just trying to be poets. Like, that feels silly and artificial to me, and also reinforces hierarchical systems of oppression and bias that we're really trying to not have anymore. So I think that's part of it too, is sometimes especially people who are young in their study of creative writing, they wonder, well, does my stuff count, or does the people I like count? That's something we talk about a lot in poetry. A lot of us who are younger found the poets we love first in Instagram, and there are a lot of old school traditional paper brick and mortar institution publishing poets who are like, Instagram doesn't count, those people aren't poets. I'm like, we're already esoteric enough as poets. Let's not exclude more people from our camp. Let's welcome everybody. Let's have a bigger campfire, not a smaller campfire. So those debates are happening always, all the time. They're shifting a little bit based on how readership is found, how readers get themselves to the poems that they read, and how technology informs how publishing happens. But those kinds of struggles continue, and I try, especially when I'm working with students I haven't worked with before in a semester, I try to, over time, with a slow but attentive process, be like, nope, let's break all those things down. Your poem, you are a poet because you write poems and because you read poems. It's that simple. Nobody gets to decide otherwise. And I think in my own poetry, thinking about myself as a writer, I struggled with that a lot because, everybody's writing into the void. Why does my entry point in the void matter than anybody else's? But I'm curious. I bring that curiosity to what I share, and I hope that other people will see themselves when they read my stuff and find their own window, their own opening into sharing their creativity too, and their curiosity.
Nice. Yeah. You mentioning Instagram made me want to ask you a question.
Okay.
If you don't have an opinion on this, we don't have to talk about it. But do you have an opinion on what I'm going to call the rupee carification of poetry?
I almost mentioned her in my previous chat because she comes up all the time.
Yeah, I know a lot of her style of poetry. I feel like has made poetry feel a lot more accessible.
Yeah,
to
definitely.
People who aren't as I don't know, big words.
I'm gonna write a pantoum. I'm gonna write a villanelle.
Yeah, I'm gonna write a perfectly crafted sonnet.
Yeah.
Proper rhythm, rhyme scheme, everything, right amount of syllables, all of that. It's a lot. I feel like it makes it a lot more accessible.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of people also feel like it makes it cheaper, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
This is a debate that comes up all the time, and I resist being in either or camps, except in very black and white cases where don't hate people, don't be a bigot.
Absolutely.
Don't murder, probably feels like a good one. But I feel like people who want to have debates about whether somebody who's younger and more successful than them counts are feeling pretty precarious and pretty vulnerable, and feeling like the systems that have traditionally benefited them are maybe going to benefit more people who don't look like them. And I think that shift is good and important. We need more people, again, at the campfire. We need to invite more people. I feel like it's that thing with the pie. People have a graph of a pie. People feel like the literary world is a pie, and if somebody gets a piece of pie, that you're not going to get that pie. That metaphor doesn't hold. I mean, everybody can have access to that. So I think this artificial flurry or frenzy, oh my gosh, people on Instagram are doing this thing, we're nervous that people have bought more copies of Rupi Kaur stuff than they did the Odyssey. Like that was a big thing that was out for a while. I think whatever access point human people can get to reading things that help them feel validated as complex beings who have a hard time being alive, living with difficult emotions and difficult experiences, and help them feel more like they're not alone, that is always good. In terms of the craft side of her poems, it doesn't matter what I personally feel or don't feel. She makes in the way that she makes, and she reaches an audience, and people feel seen, and that's the important thing. I'm not about saying somebody doesn't count. I'm about both, and I'm about how did you find your way to her? That's amazing. Let's read more poets too. Like, it's always a door. It's always a window.
Definitely. I feel like it definitely works as a door because I know a lot of people my age, a lot of young girls my age, they start, like, that's where a lot of their poetry start is because it's accessible to us, and it's written also by a young woman, you know, so it's usually about, like, girl problems, and so, like, girls are just like, oh my gosh,
which are too often dismissed, and there's finally a space for them.
They buy their little Rupi Kaur book from Books A Million, and then they take pictures of it, and they post it on their Snapchat whenever they're feeling sad. Yay. Like, oh, I just got my heart broken by my freshman year boyfriend, and I'm very sad about that, and that's so valid.
Yes.
And girls, 9th grade girls need something.
That is a specific pain, and Rupi Kaur gives us a container for that pain.
She does. And then, I mean, she's also evolved a lot with her poetry as well. I mean, like, she has published so many things. Great for her. And she it's not all 10-word little poems, you know. She's got longer stuff too, and I feel like it's a great starting point for a lot of people because I feel like a lot of young women my age get their starting point there and then get more interested in poetry and then start exploring more and then writing their own poetry, and they start with little short poems like she writes, and then they start writing big, long, wonderful epics if they want to. Like, they can do whatever they want, and I feel like it's just good, and I feel like no matter what emotions you're expressing them, and somebody can find solace in that and find community in that, you know, and it's gonna make the little 9th grade girls who got their heart broken feel better, and that's what matters. And
also, I mean, I think there's sometimes a difference in whether you're writing poems for yourself and for your moments and to record your memories and your days and your emotions, and there's a difference to when you're writing poems that you very much intend to have readership, that you very much intend to send out into the competitive world of literary journals and presses and publications. I think poetry is valuable in both and all the intermediary spaces. You know, I have students I work with and people who find their way to my poems who do consider themselves poets and are published or want to be published. And there are also students and readers who find themselves to my poems who just want to appreciate, or maybe they write only for themselves, and that is entirely wonderful and good and okay. I think not all poems have to be wildly experimental or imaginative in a way that, you know, this is my, you know, red letter I'm stamping onto the world of how weird and strange I am. Poems can be all different kinds of things. I mean, we go back to the music metaphor again. We have, you know, forms that have been around forever. Like, you take a blues song, it's got the same chord progression. You hear it and immediately there's a sense of familiarity. You know where that comes from. You know the history of America that comes from, and you feel welcomed and at home. And there are some blues patterns that are so sophisticated, but they all hinge on that one through line, that thread that connects us through. And I think with language, it's the same. We don't always have to be inventing. We don't always have to be reaching wildly like we're an explorer at the limits of language. Sometimes something that's familiar, something that feels like home, is the most direct way to connect with someone. So I think anybody who wants to say, oh, well, this isn't something, or we have enough people in the world telling us we're not enough, let's tell ourselves we're enough. And if Rupi Kaur is the poet who helps you feel like you're enough, let's celebrate that.
Absolutely. So, as a writer, as a published writer, as a person who teaches people how to write, what is your writing process like?
Yeah, I'm always interested in talking about writing process because I think people who aren't writers or who look from the outside onto writing think that, all of us get up at 5 a.m. and light a candle and like stare out a window metaphorically for hours until some grand idea like arrives, like a visitation in our brain, or we're the night version of that and we stay up and like at 3:30 in the morning is when all the perfect things happen. I think there's no one right process. You kind of have to discover it for yourself. For me, I find I tend to do things in seasons, which makes sense since I have an academic career, but I'm a little bit opposite. A lot of my friends who are writers and professors do a lot of their first draft stuff, like new material in the summer. That doesn't work for me at all. Summer, I just need to like be alive and do interesting things and, add to the well, and be a magpie and collect weird things and experiences and people and memories to write about. But I do write a lot in the fall and winter and early spring because I'm like really activated by what my students are doing. So thinking about a process on a calendar level, fall, winter, early spring, I'm writing new stuff. Late spring, summer, early fall, I'm sending stuff out for possible publication. And then when I'm thinking about actually writing new stuff, for me, it's almost always pen and paper notebook. Over the years, I've figured out like what's my very specific favorite pen and my very specific favorite notebook. Like the textural feel underneath my hand is important. I'm like that kind of quirky poet girly where I need to feel it. It needs to be tactile. And I have this quirky thing where I'll write a poem longhand and I'll just kind of let it live there for a while. I don't immediately type it up. I almost never draft new stuff onto a computer because the digitalness, like the clicky clacky of the keys, feels like it's a different kind of thinking for me. The pen moving kind of forces me to create a funnel from my imagination, like through my thoughts into, okay, now I'm like, I don't know if it's feels like the ink in the pen is like a pasta extruder or something. Like the idea is coming out. It's a little bit focused, like the stuff is coming through. And I like the weird tactile feeling. I like being in that moment. I try as much as possible if I'm working on a new poem to draft all of it meaning like beginning to end in the same sitting because I like to stay in that mind space. But then I have this weird thing where once it's drafted, once I'm committed to it becoming like the most interesting version of itself, that's when I'll type it. Because then it kind of has this new life. It's out of my brain and into the, I don't know, if it's like putting it in the file on the computer is like putting it in a file or like sending it to the post office where it's like imagining going out into the world. But then when I revise, I print it out and then like handwrite over it again, like scribble scrabble all over it because I like to interact and intervene in the lines and the words. And I almost always write poems toward a larger project. I usually don't write one-off poems where I don't really know what larger community they're building into creatively. I'm really interested in the poetry collection as a form that is understudied and underexplored in the poetry world. People know what that beast is and all the ways it can present itself into the world, but I think not a lot of people encounter poems that way as part of a larger collection, a whole book. So I'm always interested in how a single poem can have its own life, like as an episode. Like you watch one episode of whatever sitcom you love and it's hopefully a standalone, but also of course it has more life when looked at through like, ooh, season 1 this character did that and now in season 3 they're doing this. And so like you get to have poems that have that arc, which is really interesting. So I usually write poems that are building toward that larger statement, and sometimes I have a little bit of a aesthetic quirk I'm building into, like my chapbook that came out in November of 2022. I wrote most of those poems like during COVID isolation, but not in the beginning and not at the very end. So not in the beginning, freak out, holy crud, what is this? And not at the end, like, yay, we have vaccines, thank you, science. But somewhere in the middle where, I didn't know yet if we were going to have vaccines, and I was teaching all online, which felt safe and smart, but also distanced and sad because I get my energy from interacting with people. So I wrote those poems about that very, very weird cognitive dissonance we were all in. We're literally living another world historical event. Why? So the poems were all about feeling like an alien in my own brain. So the collection is titled Autobiography, and I got this idea that each poem was going to be a metaphor for my brain, like how it felt like it was trying to be okay again in this strange world, but all of them were titled autobiography. That was the sort of hook for me. The fact that they all started the same way gave me a place to return to, you know, in the act of writing and creating every day. And I also like this idea that each one is kind of a variant of the other. I also like the idea that when you hear the word autobiography, you think, okay, story of a life told by that person, and none of them are narrative at all. So I like to sort of buck genre expectations that way. But that's a lot of how I write. I figure out what is the thing that I'm curious about, and I write for, you know, some long extended period of time into that particular curiosity. It reminds me of, there's a poet who's doing great things right now and is really active on social media and really generous in what he shares about himself as a creative person. His name is Chen Chen, and I don't remember exactly verbatim what the text is that he tweeted, but his Twitter, I know it's X now. I refuse. It's always going to be Twitter.
It's always Twitter.
His Twitter is great because some of it is very engaged and literary and part of like the discourse on poetry community, and others of it are like, here's a picture of me in my lovely sneakers. So he's a beautiful human and is very fun to watch. But I forget if this tweet was a reaction to something else that people were saying on literary Twitter, or if it came, you know, extemporaneously with whatever he was thinking about at the time. But he was challenging this idea that, you know, advisors of young poets or literary theorists at large are always curious for poets to find their voice. There's this phrase, like, find your voice, figure out what your voice is. And that can be helpful. That can be guiding and directing. But he was suggesting, well, maybe a better question is to figure out what you're curious about. And I think about that all the time, because I feel like while find your voice feels helpful, the idea of find your voice, like the semantics of that phrase, makes me think, okay, well, you figure it out and then you're done figuring it out. Like, you are this person, and voice could be label. Like, are you a mouthpiece for this part of your identity or this part of where you came from? That doesn't always feel genuine and like coming from yourself as a creative person. And figuring out what you're curious about honors this idea that creativity is always a process. You never figure it out and then you're done figuring it out. You might figure the it out of this poem you're working on, but if it's not always continually about discovery and growth and opening yourself to new kinds of understanding, then what are you here for?
Yeah.
So I think that's what I think about a lot when I'm writing now, is instead of what's your voice, because that's given me a lot of consternation throughout the years, I think, what are you curious about? With the find your voice question, it makes me think about, you know, my early years in graduate school when I was still trying to figure out what my aesthetic was. You know, that's something I think about, you know, returning to a point we talked about earlier. I didn't even know what I liked. I just decided I liked everything because that showed that I was, quote unquote, like a good student. I can find a way to like everything. Well, if you like everything, it's kind of the same as not liking anything, because you can't discern and make thoughtful choices and be intentional. So I had a lot of consternation about, what is my voice? Okay, well, I have a female body. Is my voice, I'm a woman now? I don't always lean with a gendered sensibility into what I'm curious about, so that felt limiting. But also then I wanted to read more women poets and non-binary and gender diverse poets who are writing from that perspective, sometimes intentionally and directly, and sometimes just by, like, I read their bio and see what pronouns they use. Like, okay, I think finding your voice is sometimes limiting because you don't want to ever be anyone else's mouthpiece. You want to be curious in the way you are curious, and sometimes that leans forward, you know, with those pieces of your identity, and sometimes you want to wish you were a brain who wasn't in context, which is not realistic, but when we're trying to be creative, we get to imagine new ways for ourselves.
With you talking about how you like to sort of like have a project that you're working towards, sort of like a theme that you're working towards. You work with Argus, and so every year, Argus, the art and literary magazine here on NSU's campus, they have a theme every year,
Yes.
which I think is so awesome, because I feel like that gives people who want to submit a sort of ideas as to what they want to create, what they want to submit, if they have something already that they want to pull from their repertoire, that they're like, oh, let me pull this from the archives of all of the poetry that I've written, and let me submit that. Which one of my favorite themes that we had, because I did work for Argus for 2 years, was whenever we did growth and decay.
Yeah.
We got some really cool stuff, and I think reading that and as a collection forms this really awesome and cool message of like this overarching theme, and all the different ways that people can explore that and how people feel about those themes. I think it's just so cool.
Yeah. And there's something to, I haven't talked a ton about publishing. I could talk for 2 hours just about publishing. But it reminds me of, you know, when I was first starting to send poems out and getting those first early acceptances into literary journals, there's something really magical about seeing your work suddenly in a community with all this other work. You look at it in an entirely different way. And there have been some journals that have had interesting themes, but you get to see, when you publish in a journal like Argus or like other journals out there, you get to see suddenly your work in context with other creative work, and it's so cool. So I was talking about this online journal called the Cordella Review. I'll pull it up. I just recently had a poem accepted in their issue 18, and it's called The Gloaming.
Ooh.
And they don't really have an aesthetic statement in terms of what they mean by the gloaming, but there's this kind of ephemeral, peripheral, like daytime, nighttime, low light kind of curiosity space. They included this poem of mine that mentions fireflies, and I thought that was a really cool connection to this idea of gloaming. And I'll read this poem because it's kind of fun. It's called The Girl Gives a Grand Tour of Her Self-Portrait, age 6. So the voice of this poem is as if I'm actually imagining myself as a 6-year-old, and I'm very proud of this drawing I just drew of myself. So this appears in issue 18, Gloaming of Cordella magazine. The girl gives a grand tour of her self-portrait, age 6. 4 foot something, head like a circle, arms and legs good healthy lines, hands, feet, skin, hair. Not sure how many pounds, the right amount. Shoes my sister already had. My other sister will get them next. Look at the teeth, don't they sparkle? Notice the elbows and knees, good for climbing trees. Blackberry juice on my shirt. I keep trying to eat the sun. Check my pocket for fireflies. I keep them in case the lights go out. Don't worry, I'll let them go tomorrow. They glow better when they feel the air on their wings. My ears are my favorite part. They're like leaves. When I grow up, I'm going to be a tree.
That's really cute.
So I get to see that poem in the context of all these other gloaming things, which is a different kind of magic I hadn't envisioned, and is very fun.
I feel like a lot of the, like, maybe other poets' interpretations would be maybe more mystical or dark or whatever, and I feel like maybe that was just like a breath of fresh air, just added to it all. And I think that varying perspectives in poetry is something that's really, really cool too.
Yeah.
With that, because I feel like a lot of poetry is very moody.
Yes.
And sometimes usually sad or just really introspective.
And sometimes you can get at big feelings without writing about capital T trauma or big sad. Sometimes a way you can get at big feelings is by going through sort of a sideways way, through humor or through childlikeness, because then you feel disarmed. You're like, oh, well, isn't this cute? Oh, I didn't expect a feeling.
Yeah,
I had
like,
one.
When I grow up, I'm going to be a tree. You're not.
Nope.
You're not, though.
Nope.
I wish you could.
Right?
Like, I so wish you could. You know, it's just, I don't know, poetry's so cool. There's just so many different voices you can explore.
Even different versions of yourself. I'm imagining myself as 6. I am a lot older than 6. It was nice to be in that space again.
To be 6 years old.
That's a good age.
It is a really good
Like old enough
age.
to decide you want ice cream,
6.
not old enough to have to pay for it.
My little brother's 6, and he's just so happy. Gosh.
Yeah.
To be 6 again.
Yeah.
But also just like there's like I've seen poetry written from like animal perspectives or from the perspective of like a plant, a tree.
Yeah.
And it's just so fun. You get to play with so many fun ideas and cool things that you wouldn't normally see in a lot of like prose, because I feel like prose is a lot more people based usually.
Yeah, I think part of why I don't write fiction is because I respect people who do this work well, but I don't want to do the kind of work that was like, okay, well, I got up and how much time has passed and how much distance between this scene and that scene and how do we move the reader in space-time. I just want to have the moment. I think that's why I write poems. I just want to put us in that moment. I don't want to do the logical
I think
glue.
Poetry is really cool for capturing like a moment. And I have not written much poetry, but the poems that I have written, since there's very few of them, I remember them all pretty well. And so like I've written about like a girl that I was in love with in middle school, and I wrote a little poem about that time, and that time is come and gone, but it was like
that moment still exists.
It happened in time, and it is now here, and this captured in this little poem, and I can revisit that if I feel like I need to.
Absolutely.
You know, and it's like a great way to like address those feelings in a way that's not destructive. It's constructive. Like you're creating something with those feelings, which I think is really, really cool. And I've also written poetry about like my current relationship, some cool stuff. And it's a great way of exploring yourself and your feelings, and also how you feel about other things. Like one of my poems that I wrote was all a big euphemism for something, you know, and it's so fun that you can play with and explore different themes without being explicit about it.
Yeah, a poem can say, and also it cannot say, and it can do both at the same time, and I know that's a paradox, and it's not supposed to make sense. That's why I'm not in math and science. Respect and love to math and science. But a poem can hold all of that, and also not quite, and both, and it can undo itself, and I like that. I like that a lot.
It's really fun, because I feel like with prose it's a little more like you have to sort of explain everything. You don't have to, but it's more expected.
Right, the genre expectations set you to have a beginning, middle, end.
You gotta explore all of the things that you're looking for. Like, yes, beginning, middle, end, as opposed to just like this.
Yeah,
like, I don't need my poem does not need a beginning or middle or an end.
No, it does not.
It can be none of them.
And there's something in what you said that I want to touch on, and maybe I'll bring in another poem just because I have it up and I think it connects well. You talked about how a poem can also be a space for you to explore a different perspective. I think part of why I'm interested in writing poetry as opposed to other forms is there's this weird genre expectation that poems are always about like the self writing them. Like if you read the word I, the I is the name of the person who appears underneath the title, and like yes, there's always some truth to that. Even when I write a persona poem, and a persona poem is a poem that is explicitly from a self that's not you, I'm interested in that tension where I could try to write a poem as Amelia Earhart or a cryptid or Barack Obama, and I'm never fully any of those things. I'm always a little bit me. I think that tension is interesting.
There's always going to be a little bit of yourself in anything
Yeah,
that you
and I
write.
think that tension is interesting to explore, but also if you can imagine in the space of a poem a selfhood that is not like your lived experience, then you can extend that out to understand, hopefully, or at least try to understand other lived experiences from people who aren't like you. So there's that kind of really clear one-to-one relationship I see in poems. But also, I think the way in which we're expected to talk about ourselves is often strange. I think about this a lot, and one of my curiosities, thinking back to Chen Chen's quote, one of my continual curiosities is neuroscience and cognitive science and psychology, like the ways we interact as people and the ways the biology of our brains and our nervous systems and all that, influence the ways in which we interact. But taking a step back from that, I'm always interested in, when we get to know somebody, the kinds of questions we ask and how they're a little bit perfunctory and not very interesting. Like, where are you from? Like, where did you get your degree? Like, what's your major? What do you do? As if those things define who you are. And we know they don't, but we have to have some sort of conversational, societal shorthand.
And I feel like those are like just basic things about people but you gotta get to know the basics first usually before you get to know people deeper. Because I literally had a conversation just like this last night. My roommate just got a new person that she's involved with, and then he was over and I was like, how old are you?
Yeah.
What's your major? These are just things I need to know about you. And which we can get to know each other on a deeper level another time, but this is like, you've been around for a couple days now, and I realize I don't know anything about you. So.
And that's so interesting, because I was going to say, for like the person who's answering the questions, it's a protection mechanism. I'm going to say these things that you could Google about me, but you're saying also in the asking sense, it's a protection thing. Like, I'm not going to let you get next to my people if you're not okay.
Yeah, and I immediately, like, I was like, how old are you? And he was like, 19, and I was like, cool,
Acceptable.
I'm 21.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Yeah.
What's your major? Okay, here's mine.
Yeah.
Just, this is an exchange of information.
Yeah.
I'm going to get to know you, you're going to get to know me, but at this safe level first, before I'm not going to tell you about my traumatic childhood right now. We don't need to.
We're
we
gonna
don't
save
need to
that
explore
for a maybe.
these.
Yeah.
We don't need to explore these right now. You didn't need to know my deepest, darkest secrets. But what I do need to know is how old you are.
Yes.
Right now.
So that makes me think of this poem I want to share. That it has a long title. For a while I was experimenting with long titles because they're fun, but also when I was trying to make that pivot from graduate student to junior faculty, I was thinking, oh, this is a brilliant idea. If my poems with really long titles start to get accepted, then it'll make my CV look longer. So like that was also a little bit of a thing. But anyway, this leans into the stuff we've been talking about because it's something I'm curious about. And this was published by Harbor Review online a couple of years ago. The poem is titled, "What if, when we introduced ourselves, we told these stories instead? I thought I knew God once as a girl in New Hampshire, climbing a mountain so big and glorious and flooded with sunlight, I nearly gave way only half through the forests and rocks and streams. But something lifted me I still can't name. I'll never be sure. Every time it rains a real rain in any of the small towns I find myself living in, which is to say, towns where I begin falling asleep absently over time and building routines around dish drains and the cat's polite shits piling in his box underneath plastic bags filled with other plastic grocery bags, I look at how the water leaps out the gutters like it's escaping the house. And I remember it rained the day I saw the Colosseum in Rome. I remember it was loud, like I was under a jar, and the gargoyles were shouting back what the sky kept yelling. Twice I've traveled the entire east-west of Iowa by train. Fresh-eyed boys playing guitar in the lounge car, cornfield skies swallowing light down the windows, Amish families filling seats with some hidden steadiness I envied. The hauntings they carried were ancestors. Mine were worries wringing their invisible hands. In one memory, rickety in my footing between rail cars, my husband and I want hot food so much we pay $7 each for plastic bowls of reheated macaroni and cheese. One time, I stole toilet paper from the 19th floor of a Japanese office building. About a dozen others went with me. We needed it. We had lost our jobs there. We needed the gesture, too, that tiny, useless revenge we could bring with us to our bathrooms and meter out privately in little ribbons of loss. So I was just playing with this idea. What if we had a reality in which small talk could be a place where we reveal these things about ourselves rather than, I grew up in Northfield, population 6,000, this is my alma mater, this is this. Not entirely practical, but interesting to imagine.
I feel like that's fun. I feel like that's something I involuntarily do also whenever I start talking to people, because I personally am a yapper. I talk so much all the time, and I can't stop myself a lot of the time, and then I realize, I'm like, I just shared this information with you that you don't really need to know.
And it happened, and it's in the air now. Sorry.
Now you know it.
Yeah.
Like, now you know. Which I feel like should be a little more normalized. Like, I feel like whenever I'm having a conversation with someone and then they let slip something that they don't, like, mean, like, a part of their personality they don't mean to show yet, and then they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, like, you didn't need to know that. And I'm like, I want to.
I'm curious.
Like,
Why do you feel like you've offended
tell
me? Yeah.
anything you ever want to tell me ever.
Mm-hmm.
I love learning things about people. I love letting people be themselves. I love being myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hate whenever I accidentally let something slip and then the person is weird about it instead of just being like, oh, it's fine. Like, let's move on.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like that should be more normalized. I think it's so cool, and I wish that was...
It's great when you get to the place where you can make the bingo card of things that they say. Like, oh, so-and-so said this again. Like, there was this social group, I won't out anybody, but we used to play games together all the time, and we would joke about, okay, if this was so-and-so's bingo card, here are all the things. Like, throughout the night, they will say all of them. And it's fun when you get to know people that level, on that level.
I feel like there's definitely some bingo cards out there about me. I tell a lot of the same stories and say a lot of the same things. A lot. It's the ADHD. I repeat the same things over and over and over and over and over again. My roommates could definitely make one about me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I'd be able to make one about them because they're a lot more tame than I am. But I'm a lot.
I think it's good when we get to know our repetitions, the things we go over and over again. You know, I talk about that sometimes in class when I'm helping young writers. They're like, oh, crud, I'm writing about trees again. Okay, well, does it mean you're really curious about trees, or does it mean you're lazy and can't come up with new images? It's probably the first one. Mm-hmm. Just recast it differently. You're learning what you're curious about.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That's a great way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. When you turn an obsession not into a problem, but into a point of information you now know about yourself.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wow. Wow.
Realization sound.
Wow. It's one of my favorite sounds to hear whenever I'm teaching, too. It's like, wow.
Yep. It's the sound of connection. It's the sound of ideas. Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah.
Yes.
So, as we're wrapping up here, towards the end of our episode, I was wondering if you had any points that you feel like a writer could really take away from the conversation that we've been having over the course of this past hour.
Yeah. I think one of the absolute most important things is you're likely reading and receiving and encountering lots of competing advice that's maybe overly generalized. Like, all good writers get up at 5:30 in the morning, or all great writers write every day, or only the best writers insert, fill the blank here. There is no one way to be a writer other than make words happen. You have to figure out the way that works for you, and you might have to try out things to know that they don't work for you. Maybe you decide, okay, for the month of April, I'm going to be a morning writer. You try that on, see if it fits, see if it doesn't fit. You learn yourself, learn what process feels good, find ways to make accountability easy. And by accountability, I don't mean external things like I have to write so many things in X amount of time. I have this publication goal in mind, so I have to do this by like September 15th. Like, not technical accountability, but accountability that's going to feel real. So especially when I'm advising writers who are kind of newer on their discovery of themselves and their process, I like to think about, I think it was Robert Vivian, who's faculty where I got my Master of Fine Arts, who said this thing about his own writing practice. He says, every time I show up to the act of writing, I show up without hope or despair. So know yourself. How I take that to mean is I'm going to be here for whatever that means. If it's a time goal, if it's a word goal, like, I'm going to be here. And here means being present for the creative moment, present in the introspection, the reflection you need for ideas to come. I don't like to say, well, I'm going to write 5 poems this week, or I'm going to write X number of words, or I'm going to write for exactly 4 hours. I know that doesn't work for me, but those very specific, precise goals are motivating for some. Try out different approaches. Try out the thing you can do in a routine way that's going to set you up to succeed. I don't agree with Ernest Hemingway about a lot of things, but I do like the thing he said, leave yourself knowing what is going to come next. So, like, if I'm writing a poem or writing a list or revising, I like to, complete that moment, that gesture, and then try to figure out when I show up next, what's the thing I'm going to start with. I don't always hold myself to that. I might come to the page or the screen that day and realize, oh, I've got a new idea that feels like it's first in line, raising its hand, like ready for the bathroom or whatever. That was a weird thing to say. But like, when you feel the energy, you've got to follow the energy, but set yourself up with patterns and routines that are going to make it more likely that that energy is going to show up. You've got to find out your own way. And I really think that following this idea of learning what you're curious about and honoring what you're curious about is going to get you there. I think don't worry in the creation moment. What is this writing for? Who is this reader for? Where might I publish it? Does this even matter? Am I a writer? Just like be in that moment, feel the thing. Later is the time for those kinds of questions to figure out how you're going to shape it, what it might or might not become. I think as long as you're always curious, as long as you're always showing up in a way that makes sense to you, not in a way that makes sense to other people who don't know your inner self and how you like to share and express your ideas, that's what's going to make you. And you are a writer by deciding that you are a writer. You can get a little bit more nuanced about the definition later once you figure out, like, do you want readers or do you not want readers? Do you want to publish or do you not want to publish? What is your writing for? It's always for you. And then you get to decide if it's for anything else next. It's always for you. You need to find your own way. And if people are telling you things that feel like they're causing you to stray from the version you feel like you intuitively are, pay attention to that. Like sometimes challenge is useful because it helps shake you out of a habit that might not be helpful or an understanding that may not be helpful. But listen to yourself. Try to develop that sense of intuition. We talked about earlier, sometimes it's hard to know who we are at the core. It's hard to even know what we like or we don't like. But showing up, thinking back to that quote by Robert Vivian, showing up without hope or despair, you're being there, you're being present with yourself and your creativity and your ideas, and that's always the first step. Pay attention, learn what you're telling yourself in that moment, and be curious, be excited, be your own sort of champion, and then worry about the other stuff later. Showing up is the first most important thing.
And I think being open to change with all that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if you like this one thing now, maybe you won't like it later, and it's okay to change. Like if you write a certain type of poetry, like you're really into writing haikus or sonnets. I lack a lot of poetry terms because I'm not super into it. But if that's what you're really into, then you decide maybe that's not what's working for me anymore. Just be open to change, be open to exploration. You don't have to stick to one style. You don't have to stick to one voice. You don't have to stick to one type.
I write so differently. I think part of my process and part of jumping off of what you said, advice I might give to writers figuring out themselves and their way is don't be afraid to reinvent yourself all the time. I think that's what keeps things interesting. I write so differently compared to how I used to write. I used to write mostly exclusively really short image-based poems. And I could talk for a whole other hour, but I won't. On all the different interventions mentors have had with me where they've been in that space for me, prompting meaningful challenge. Like I had one professor who I was really trying to write about things in the present moment. Like I wanted the poems to feel really tangible, really alive, really now. And she said, okay, so this is I forget the numbers exactly, but this is a 15-line poem and you've used the word this 8 times. Like, what does this mean? And like we had a little bit of reckoning. Like I was struggling to render a poem that felt really present and alive, and I was just relying on coming back to that word over and over again. And then I pivoted out. I used to really not, just personal preference, enjoy reading prose poems. Now I love prose poems, and I'm writing a whole bunch of little weird ones, and that feels cool. So that's part of, staying in tune to what you're curious about. You're not going to be curious about the same things all the time. It's newness and surprise and development and evolution is definitely part of what this whole deal is.
All right, well, thank you for joining me, Dr. Macijeski. This was a very fun, lively conversation that we had. I had a good time. I hope you did too.
I did. Thanks for inviting me. It's been good.
Of course. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Thinkers, Tinkers, and Talkers.